Somewhere in the world, there is a person sitting on approximately $50 billion, and they have never spent a single cent of it. That money, if you can even call it that, sits in a digital wallet. It has sat there for over 15 years, untouched, unspent, silent. The person who owns it created something that changed the financial world forever. They built a system used by hundreds of millions of people. They were nominated for the Nobel Prize in Economics. And then, they simply disappeared. No press conference, no farewell, no explanation, just silence. Tonight we're going to follow the trail they left behind. We're going to walk through the world as it was in 2008, broken, frightened, and desperate for something new. We're going to read the document that started everything. We're going to meet the small handful of people who knew this mysterious figure, even if only through a screen. We are going to explore what Bitcoin actually is and why it appeared at the exact moment it did. We're going to trace the early days of a network that ran for weeks with only one user. We're going to follow the clues, examine the suspects, and sit quietly with the parts of the story that may never be resolved. And we're going to ask the question that no one has been able to answer. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? Get comfortable. Let your body settle. There is nowhere you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to do. Just listen. This is a long story, and it is one of the strangest true stories ever told. Close your eyes. To understand why Bitcoin was created, you first need to understand the world it was born into. It was the autumn of 2008, and the world was coming apart. For most people, the first sign that something was wrong came quietly. A neighbor putting a for sale sign in their yard, a colleague who stopped coming into work, a news segment about a bank you had never heard of suddenly going under. Then the signs started coming faster. In September of 2008, Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest and most powerful investment banks in the United States, collapsed. It had been founded in 1850. It had survived the American Civil War, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and a dozen financial crises in between. It had over 25,000 employees in offices around the world. It managed hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. It happened over a single weekend. On Friday, it was one of the most respected financial institutions in the world. By Monday morning, it was gone. The shockwaves moved through the global economy like a slow earthquake. Stock markets fell. Credit dried up. Businesses that had nothing to do with Wall Street suddenly found they could not get loans. Workers were laid off. Homes were repossessed. Families who had done everything right, saved carefully, bought a home they could afford, worked steady jobs, found themselves standing in the ruins of a system they had trusted completely. In the United States alone, over 8 million people lost their jobs. Nearly 4 million families lost their homes. Retirement savings that had taken decades to build were wiped out in months. People who had planned to retire found themselves working into their 70s to rebuild what the crisis had taken. But here's the thing that made so many people quietly furious. The banks that had caused the crisis did not collapse. They were saved. The United States government and governments around the world stepped in with enormous amounts of public money to rescue the very institutions that had created the disaster. In the United States, the Troubled Asset Relief Program authorized $700 billion to bail out the financial sector. In the United Kingdom, the government pumped hundreds of billions of pounds into failing banks. Similar rescues happened across Europe, in Asia, in every corner of the global economy. It was called a bailout. The banks that had gambled recklessly with other people's money were deemed too big to fail. Their executives kept their bonuses, their shareholders were protected, and the bill was handed to the ordinary citizens who had trusted them. There was a name for what had gone wrong. It was called counterparty risk. When you put your money in a bank, you are trusting that the bank will be there when you need it back. You are trusting that the people managing your money are acting in your interest. You are trusting the entire system of oversight and regulation that is supposed to keep those people honest. In 2008, that trust was broken. Completely and visibly broken. For millions of people, something shifted permanently in how they thought about money, about institutions, and about who was actually in control of their financial lives. What had actually caused the crisis was a story of accumulated failures. For years, American banks had been offering mortgages to people who could not really afford them, using financial instruments so complex that even the people selling them barely understood what they were doing. They had bundled these risky mortgages together into products with sophisticated names and AAA credit ratings, and sold them to investors around the world. Everyone in the chain collected fees. Everyone assumed that someone else was managing the risk. No one was managing the risk. When the housing market turned and millions of people began to default on loans they had never really been able to afford, the entire edifice collapsed simultaneously. The philosopher and writer Nassim Nicholas Taleb had written, just 2 years earlier, about what he called black swan events. Rare, catastrophic, impossible to predict occurrences that changed everything. The financial crisis of 2008 was not strictly speaking a black swan. There were economists who had seen it coming, there were analysts who had warned about it, but the system had no mechanism to stop itself. The incentives were all pointing in the wrong direction. Make money now, worry later, trust the institution, trust the rating agency, trust the regulator, trust the system. And the system failed. But there was a small community of people for whom none of this was a surprise. They were called cypherpunks. The name sounds almost playful, but the idea behind it was serious. Since the early 1990s, a loose network of cryptographers, programmers, and libertarian philosophers had been exchanging ideas on an email mailing list. They believed, deeply believed, that privacy was a fundamental human right, and they believed that the future of privacy and the future of freedom itself would be decided by mathematics. The cypherpunk movement had a specific founding moment. In 1992, a mathematician named Eric Hughes, a programmer named Timothy C. May, and a computer scientist named John Gilmore began meeting in San Francisco. They were joined by a small group of like-minded individuals, and soon they established an email mailing list. At its peak, the list had thousands of subscribers, though the most active participants were a much smaller core. Hughes wrote a document called A Cypherpunk's Manifesto. It opened with a declaration that has only grown more relevant in the decades since. Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. The manifesto argued that privacy could not be granted by governments or corporations because both had every incentive to reduce it. Privacy had to be built into the technical infrastructure of communication itself. Privacy had to be mathematically guaranteed. Their heroes were not politicians or bankers. They were mathematicians and engineers. One of those heroes was David Chaum. In the early 1980s, Chaum had been a doctoral student at Berkeley when he described something called blind signatures, a way to create digital money that could be spent anonymously without a bank tracking every transaction. His 1985 paper, Security Without Identification, Transaction Systems to Make Big Brother Obsolete, reads today like a prophetic document. It described, in precise mathematical terms, a world in which individuals could conduct financial transactions without any central authority tracking their behavior. Chaum went on to found a company called DigiCash, which built and deployed an actual working digital currency in the early 1990s. DigiCash was used by a small number of banks in pilot programs. It worked, technically, but it was ahead of its time, and the commercial conditions for it did not exist. DigiCash filed for bankruptcy in 1998. Other researchers followed. In 1997, Adam Back proposed a system called hashcash, a way of using computational work as a kind of proof to prevent spam email. The idea that computational effort could serve as a form of currency would later become fundamental to how Bitcoin worked. In 1998, a computer scientist named Wei Dai published a proposal called B-Money, a system for anonymous, distributed electronic cash. B-Money described, at a high level, ideas that would later appear in Bitcoin, but it was a theoretical proposal, not an implementation. Also in 1998, a cryptographer and legal scholar named Szabo described something he called bit gold, a digital commodity that would require computational work to produce, that could not be counterfeited, and that could be transferred without a trusted intermediary. Szabo spent years developing and refining this idea. He never built it. For almost 20 years, the cypherpunks talked, and they tried. Each attempt was fascinating. Each one fell short. The problems were genuinely hard. How do you prevent someone from spending the same digital token twice without a central database to track every transaction? How do you create a system that doesn't have a single point of control, and therefore a single point of failure or attack? How do you make something that is decentralized but still consistent, that is anonymous but still trustworthy? These were not just technical problems. They were fundamental questions about how trust works at scale. And every proposed solution created new problems in its place. Someone on that mailing list had been reading all of it, taking notes, thinking carefully, for years perhaps, maybe decades. And that person had been watching the collapse of 2008 with something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but perhaps something closer to confirmation. The world they had warned about had arrived, and they were ready. On October 31st, 2008, Halloween, an email arrived in the inboxes of a small number of people subscribed to the cryptography mailing list. The subject line was simple: Bitcoin P2P e-cash paper. The sender's name was Satoshi Nakamoto. Almost no one had heard that name before. The email was short. It read in part, "I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer, with no trusted third party." Attached was a link to a 9-page document, a white paper. Its full title was Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. 9 pages. That was all it was. 9 pages that described, in careful and precise technical language, a system that would eventually be worth trillions of dollars. Now, it is worth pausing here to understand what was actually being proposed, because it was genuinely new. Not just new in a small way, new in a fundamental way. The problem that had always blocked the idea of digital cash was something called the double spend problem. Imagine you have a digital file that represents $1. I send that file to you. Now you have it, and I don't. Simple enough. But what stops me from making a copy of that file first and sending the copy to you while keeping the original? What stops me from spending the same digital dollar in 2 different places at the same time? In the physical world, this is not a problem. When I hand you a banknote, I no longer have it. The transfer is physical and final. But digital information is infinitely copyable. That is its nature. Every previous attempt to solve this had relied on a central authority, a trusted middleman, a company or institution that kept track of all the transactions and made sure no one spent the same money twice. A bank, in other words. This solution works technically, but it has a cost. The cost is that you have to trust the bank. And as 2008 had just demonstrated, that trust can be misplaced. Satoshi's paper proposed something different. What if the record of all transactions was kept not by one central authority, but by everyone? What if there was a public ledger, visible to anyone, maintained by thousands of computers around the world, that recorded every single transaction in order? A chain of blocks, each one containing a batch of transactions, each one mathematically linked to the one before it? A record that could not be altered without redoing an enormous amount of computational work? What if trust was not held by a person, but distributed across a network? The insight was elegant and, in retrospect, obvious in the way that all truly original ideas seem obvious after the fact. Instead of solving the problem of digital double spending by trusting a central authority, Satoshi proposed solving it by making all transactions visible to everyone simultaneously. If everyone can see the ledger, no one can lie about it. Not because they are honest, but because any lie would be immediately detectable. The mechanics of how this worked involved several technical innovations layered on top of each other. The first was the blockchain itself, the public ledger. Every transaction that had ever been made in Bitcoin was recorded here in chronological order, grouped into blocks. Each block contained a cryptographic hash of the previous block, a kind of mathematical fingerprint. If you tried to alter any earlier transaction, you would change the fingerprint of that block, which would change the fingerprint of the next block, which would cascade forward through the entire chain. Altering history would require redoing all the computational work for every block after the change. The second was the proof-of-work system. Adding a new block to the chain required solving a difficult mathematical puzzle. The puzzle could only be solved by trial and error, by guessing millions or billions of times per second until the right answer was found. This was called mining. The computer that solved the puzzle got to add the next block and received a reward in newly created Bitcoin. The third was the network itself, decentralized, with no single computer in control. Thousands of computers around the world would each maintain a copy of the complete blockchain. If one was taken down or tried to submit a fraudulent block, the rest of the network would reject it. An attacker would need to control more than half of the entire network's computational power to successfully manipulate the ledger. And as the network grew, that became exponentially more difficult. The people who received that email in October 2008 were not immediately convinced. Some were skeptical, some were dismissive. James Donald, one of the first to respond, wrote back, "We very, very much need such a system. But the way I understand your proposal, it does not seem to scale to the required size." This was a reasonable concern, and Satoshi addressed it patiently and in detail. The history of digital cash was littered with ambitious proposals that had failed. Why would this one be different? But the paper was technically serious. The author clearly knew what they were talking about. The mathematics was sound. They had not just described a concept. They had worked through the details, considered the edge cases, and produced something that felt like it could actually work. And the timing, arriving just weeks after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, just weeks after the old financial system had shown everyone exactly how vulnerable centralized trust could be. The timing was almost poetic. A few people wrote back to Satoshi Nakamoto with questions. They received answers, thoughtful, detailed, patient answers. Whoever was behind that name clearly understood the material deeply. They had thought about edge cases. They had considered objections. They had done the work. But who were they? The email address was satoshi@vistomail.com. Later they would use satoshiin@gmx.com. Both were anonymous accounts, easily created and easily abandoned. The name Satoshi Nakamoto is Japanese. In Japanese, Satoshi can mean wise or clear thinking. Nakamoto means middle origin or one who lives in the middle. It is a real Japanese name. Many people have it. But was the person behind it actually Japanese? Actually named Satoshi? Actually a single person at all? Researchers who later studied Satoshi's writing carefully noticed that their English was fluent and natural, almost certainly the writing of a native speaker, or someone extraordinarily proficient in the language. The idioms were correct. The phrasing was confident. There were none of the subtle errors that typically appear in writing by non-native speakers. The spelling, when it varied, tended to follow British English conventions. Color rather than color. Organize rather than organize. Timestamps in Satoshi's early forum posts suggested activity patterns consistent with someone in a European time zone, though this could easily have been faked. No one knew, and Satoshi Nakamoto was not particularly interested in answering. On January 3, 2009, at exactly 18 minutes and 15 seconds past 2 in the afternoon, Greenwich Mean Time, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the world. The first Bitcoin block was mined. It was called the Genesis block. Block 0, the foundation of everything that came after. Mining is the process by which new blocks are added to the Bitcoin blockchain. It requires computers to solve an enormously difficult mathematical puzzle. The first computer to solve the puzzle gets to add the next block to the chain and receives a reward in newly created Bitcoin. In those early days, that reward was 50 Bitcoin. On January 3, 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto mined the Genesis block alone. There was no one else. The network existed only on their computer. They gave themselves 50 Bitcoin as a reward, 50 coins that no one could buy or sell yet because the system was brand new and had no users. Those 50 coins from the Genesis block have an unusual property. Due to a quirk in the original code, possibly intentional, they can never be spent. They sit in the very first address in Bitcoin's history, permanently locked. Whether this was deliberate symbolism or an oversight, no one knows. But embedded in that first block, Satoshi left something that was not part of the technical specification. It was a message, a small piece of text, encoded permanently into the foundation of the entire Bitcoin network. It read, "The Time 03 Jan 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." This was the headline from the front page of the Times of London newspaper on that exact date. It referred to the ongoing financial crisis, to the British government's decision to pour more public money into banks that had failed. The choice of that headline was not accidental. It was a statement, a timestamp, and a declaration at the same time. It said, "This is why this exists. This system was built because the old system failed. The old system is failing again right now, on the very day this new one begins." It also served as proof. Satoshi could not have embedded a future newspaper headline. The Genesis block was genuinely mined on January 3, 2009, and not before. It was a timestamp validated against the public record of human events. For several weeks, the Bitcoin network ran with just one user, Satoshi alone, mining blocks into the void. Think about what that must have been like. You have spent years, perhaps many years, working on something. You have solved problems that had defeated everyone else who tried. You have written a white paper, shared it, answered questions, built the software, and launched it into the world. And then you wait. You are running a global financial system for an audience of one. You are minting coins that have no value for transactions that have no counterparty. The blockchain grows, block by block, but only you are adding to it. And then, on January 11th, 2009, someone new joined. His name was Finney. Finney was one of the most respected cryptographers in the cypherpunk community. He was brilliant, generous with his knowledge, and deeply committed to the idea of digital privacy. He had worked on PGP, Pretty Good Privacy, one of the most important encryption tools in history. PGP was the tool that allowed ordinary people to encrypt their emails, to communicate in ways that even sophisticated adversaries could not easily intercept. Finney had been one of the key developers behind it. He was also, unusually for the cypherpunk community, an optimist. While many of his peers took a darker view of the world, focused on surveillance, on government overreach, on the ways technology could be used against individuals, Finney was someone who genuinely believed things could get better, that the right tools in the right hands could make the world more free. When Satoshi had posted the Bitcoin white paper to the mailing list in October, Finney had been one of the few people who responded with genuine enthusiasm. He wrote back, "Bitcoin seems to be a very promising idea." On January 11th, he downloaded the Bitcoin software and connected to the network. Satoshi sent him a test transaction, 10 Bitcoin. It was the first Bitcoin transaction in history. In the weeks and months that followed, Hal and Satoshi exchanged dozens of emails. Hal found bugs. Satoshi fixed them. Hal asked questions. Satoshi answered them. They were, as far as we can tell, the two most active participants in Bitcoin's earliest days. And in those emails, something quiet and human shines through. Satoshi was not a distant or cold correspondent. They were engaged, thoughtful, occasionally even a little excited. When Hal reported a bug, Satoshi thanked him. When problems were solved, there was a sense of shared satisfaction. Finney would later write publicly about those early days. He described them with warmth. He described Satoshi as careful and precise, always responsive, always working. Over the course of 2009, the Bitcoin network slowly attracted other early adopters. Martti Malmi, a young Finnish student, found the project and became one of its first contributors. He helped Satoshi develop the website, translate documentation, and communicate with a growing audience of curious technologists. Satoshi communicated with these early contributors through an online forum and through email. They were present, responsive, patient. They answered every question, fixed every bug that was reported, and continued to develop the software steadily. What is striking, reading back through these early exchanges, is how ordinary Satoshi sounds. Not cold or distant, not grandiose or ideological, just a competent, careful programmer, doing the work, grateful for help. By the end of 2009, the Bitcoin network had grown slowly to include a small but dedicated community of enthusiasts. The total number of Bitcoin in existence was growing as miners added new blocks. The software was becoming more stable. But Bitcoin had no price, no exchange rate, no market. You could not buy anything with it. You could not sell it for money. It was an experiment. Interesting, potentially significant, but ultimately a toy without real-world value. That would change. In February of 2010, a small website appeared. It was called the Bitcoin Market, and it offered something that had not existed before, an exchange where people could buy and sell Bitcoin for US dollars. The very first price agreed on that exchange was around $5 per 1,000 Bitcoin. $5 for 1,000 Bitcoin. Let that number sit for a moment. $5 for 1,000 Bitcoin. If you had taken $20 out of your wallet that day and bought 4,000 Bitcoin and held them until today, you would be holding something worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Most of the people who were paying attention to Bitcoin in those early days understood, at least intellectually, that this was possible. The early adopters were not stupid. They knew they were participating in something that might matter. But knowing something might matter and actually converting your real money into an untested digital token are different things. The gap between those two actions is where most fortunes are made and lost. In May of 2010, a programmer in Florida named Laszlo Hanyecz made a proposal on the Bitcoin forum. He offered to pay 10,000 Bitcoin to anyone who would order him 2 pizzas. A British man named Jeremy Sturdivant took him up on it. He ordered 2 Papa John's pizzas to Laszlo's address and received 10,000 Bitcoin in return. It was the first commercial transaction using Bitcoin. The first time Bitcoin was used to buy something in the real world. The pizza cost about $30. The Bitcoin was worth about $41 at the prevailing exchange rate. Today, May 22nd is celebrated in the Bitcoin community as Bitcoin Pizza Day. The 10,000 Bitcoin that Laszlo paid for those pizzas would eventually be worth, at Bitcoin's peak price, over $600 million. Laszlo has been asked many times whether he regrets it. He has always said the same thing. No. He was trying to use Bitcoin for something real. He wanted to prove that it worked as money, not just as a theoretical asset. And he proved it. The pizzas were real. The transaction was real. Bitcoin was real. Also in 2010, a website appeared that would shape Bitcoin's history in ways that no one anticipated. It was called Mt. Gox. The name came from an unrelated project. It stood for Magic the Gathering Online Exchange, a marketplace for trading cards from the popular fantasy game. The domain had been repurposed by a programmer named Jed McCaleb, who had the idea of turning it into a Bitcoin exchange. McCaleb built a basic version of the exchange and ran it for a few months before selling it to a French developer named Marc Karpeles, who moved it to Japan and turned it into what would briefly become the most important Bitcoin exchange in the world. Mt. Gox would eventually process the majority of all Bitcoin transactions on the planet, and then it would collapse spectacularly, taking hundreds of thousands of people's money with it. But that story is for another night. Through all of this, Satoshi Nakamoto was present. They were posting on the Bitcoin forums, responding to users, fixing bugs, planning updates. They seemed engaged, active, genuinely interested in the community that was forming around their creation. But there were signs even then that Satoshi was thinking about what would happen when they were no longer involved. In forum posts from 2010, Satoshi began emphasizing the decentralized nature of the project. They pointed out repeatedly that Bitcoin was designed not to depend on any single person, that the network would continue to function even if Satoshi themselves disappeared, that the software was open source, which meant anyone could examine it, modify it, continue developing it. They were building an exit ramp, carefully, methodically, as they had built everything else. Over the years, journalists, cryptographers, amateur detectives, and professional investigators have tried to answer the question that haunted Bitcoin from its earliest days. Who is Satoshi Nakamoto? We are going to look at the most serious candidates, not the wild speculation, the serious evidence-based cases, and we are going to follow each one to the place where it falls apart, because they all fall apart, every single one. The case of Hal Finney. The first person many people point to is Hal Finney himself. The evidence is circumstantial, but it accumulates. Hal Finney was one of the few people in the world with the cryptographic knowledge to write the Bitcoin white paper. He was deeply embedded in the cypherpunk community. He had spent years thinking about the exact problems that Bitcoin solved. He was the first person other than Satoshi to run the Bitcoin software. He received the very first Bitcoin transaction. His professional background fits almost perfectly. He was a developer who had worked on large, complex code bases. He understood cryptography at a research level. He had the vision to see what Bitcoin could be. There is also a geographical detail that has interested many researchers. At the time Bitcoin was being developed, Hal Finney lived in Temple City, California. A short distance away in the same neighborhood lived a man named Dorian Prentice Satoshi Nakamoto, a Japanese-American physicist and systems engineer who had worked on classified defense projects. Some researchers have suggested that Hal Finney used this nearby man's name as a pseudonym, as a kind of private joke or a layer of misdirection. The coincidence is striking enough to feel meaningful, and it might mean nothing at all. But the Hal Finney theory has a fundamental problem. When Satoshi was active, posting to forums, answering emails, writing code, Hal Finney was also active in parallel. They exchanged emails in real time. There are messages from Satoshi and messages from Hal, time-stamped within minutes of each other, demonstrating distinct, separate thought processes engaging in genuine dialogue. Unless Hal was extraordinarily committed to performing an entire separate identity for years without a single slip, unless every expression of enthusiasm, every honest question, every moment of confusion was theater, it becomes very difficult to believe they were the same person. There is also the medical dimension. After Hal was diagnosed with ALS in 2009, his ability to work was progressively limited by his illness. But Bitcoin's development continued at a pace that would have been extremely challenging for someone managing a serious progressive disease. By 2010, when Satoshi was still regularly posting detailed technical responses to complex questions, Hal's physical condition had deteriorated significantly. The evidence points away from Hal Finney, but it does not point away cleanly. Enough questions remain that some researchers still hold the door open. The case of Szabo. If there is a single candidate who fits the profile of Satoshi Nakamoto most closely on paper, it is Szabo. Szabo is a computer scientist and legal scholar with a background in cryptography. In the late 1990s, he described a concept he called bit gold, a proposed digital currency with many features that would later appear in Bitcoin. Decentralized, based on computational proof of work, resistant to counterfeiting. It was not identical to Bitcoin, but it was closer than anything else that had been proposed before. He had been working on this idea publicly for years. He wrote essays about it on his blog. He discussed it in technical forums. He had clearly thought about the problem from every angle. Szabo was also the person who coined the term smart contracts, the idea that agreements could be encoded in software and executed automatically without human intermediaries. This idea would later become one of the pillars of Ethereum and a significant part of how people think about the future of law and finance. In 2014, a team of linguistic researchers performed a detailed stylometric analysis, comparing the writing style of the Bitcoin white paper to the writing styles of various candidates. They concluded that Szabo was the most likely author. Certain unusual phrases, certain sentence structures, certain ways of constructing an argument, they appeared in Szabo's known writing and in Satoshi's writing, and rarely elsewhere. The phrase "for our purposes" appears repeatedly in both. The use of timestamp as a verb. Specific ways of explaining cryptographic concepts. The researchers found dozens of such parallels. There is also a timeline detail worth noting. Szabo had been publicly developing the BitGold concept for years. Then, in 2008, all public discussion of BitGold suddenly stopped. His blog went quiet. His forum activity ceased. Shortly afterward, the Bitcoin white paper appeared. When asked directly whether he is Satoshi Nakamoto, Szabo has always denied it, but his denials carry a strange quality. He denies it, and then he continues to engage with the question in ways that seem almost designed to sustain interest in it. He has commented on Bitcoin's development. He has offered opinions about what Satoshi would or would not have wanted. He speaks about Satoshi in the third person, but sometimes with an intimacy that sounds less like an outside observer and more like someone discussing their own earlier thinking. He has also acknowledged publicly that the parallels between BitGold and Bitcoin are not coincidental. He has described Bitcoin as a close relative of his own work. Is that the behavior of someone who genuinely knows something? Or is it simply the behavior of a person who has been so closely associated with a mystery for so long that the lines have blurred? We do not know. The Dorian Nakamoto incident. In March of 2014, Newsweek magazine published a cover story that shook the Bitcoin world. A reporter named Leah McGrath Goodman claimed to have found Satoshi Nakamoto. Not a cryptographer, not a programmer. A 64-year-old Japanese-American man named Dorian Prentice Satoshi Nakamoto, living quietly in Temple City, California, the same neighborhood where Hal Finney had lived. Dorian Nakamoto was a physicist. He had worked as an engineer on classified defense projects. He had the technical background to have built Bitcoin, and he had a name that matched exactly. The Newsweek story was a sensation. Reporters descended on Dorian Nakamoto's home. Television cameras camped on his street. The price of Bitcoin moved dramatically. Dorian Nakamoto denied everything. He said he had misunderstood a question when the reporter initially interviewed him, a moment that the reporter had interpreted as a partial admission. He said he had never heard of Bitcoin before the reporters started appearing at his door. His denial was consistent. His confusion appeared genuine. His family confirmed that he was not a programmer in the relevant sense. He did not have the technical background to write the Bitcoin white paper. His career as an engineer had involved systems work, not cryptography. And then, remarkably, a voice from the past spoke. The Satoshi Nakamoto account, dormant for years, made a post on the P2P Foundation website, which Satoshi had used in the early days of Bitcoin. The post said simply, "I am not Dorian Nakamoto." The Bitcoin community analyzed the post carefully. It appeared to come from an account that had been created in the early days, though security experts noted that such accounts could potentially be compromised. The post was brief, pointed, and offered no other information. Was it the real Satoshi, speaking for one of the last times? Was it someone else, using a compromised account? To this day, no one knows for certain, but it was enough to shift the story. The media moved on. Dorian Nakamoto, bewildered and frightened by the attention he had received, returned to his quiet life in California. The case of Craig Wright. We need to talk about Craig Wright. Not because his case is particularly convincing, it is not, but because he is the only person who has ever publicly claimed to be Satoshi Nakamoto. Craig Wright is an Australian computer scientist. He holds multiple academic degrees. He has worked in cybersecurity. In 2015, Wired and Gizmodo published stories suggesting that evidence pointed to Wright as Bitcoin's creator. The stories were based on leaked documents and technical claims. In 2016, Wright came forward publicly with the claim that he was, in fact, the creator of Bitcoin. He provided what he said was cryptographic proof, a digital signature that could only have been created by someone with access to Satoshi's private keys. The cryptography community examined his proof carefully. It did not hold up. What Wright had provided was not a genuine cryptographic signature in the expected sense. It was a technically sophisticated-looking demonstration that, when examined closely, proved only that Craig Wright was capable of creating a misleading technical presentation. The signature he produced was reconstructed from publicly available data not generated from Satoshi's private keys. The reaction from the Bitcoin and cryptographic community was swift and harsh. Some of the most respected technical voices in the space stated clearly and publicly that Wright's proof was fraudulent. Dan Kaminsky, a renowned security researcher, said the proof was fraudulent. Gregory Maxwell, a Bitcoin developer, called it a scam. Peter Todd, another well-known Bitcoin developer, said plainly, "This doesn't prove anything." The one person who might have been expected to defend Wright, Gavin Andresen, who had been one of Bitcoin's lead developers and who had met with Wright privately before the announcement, later said he had been deceived. He said he believed Wright's private demonstration had used tricks he had not been able to identify at the time. Wright has never been able to produce a convincing demonstration since. Despite years of legal battles, he has sued multiple people for billions of dollars over Bitcoin-related claims. He has never moved a single coin from Satoshi's wallets to prove his identity. Moving even a tiny fraction of one Bitcoin from one of Satoshi's known addresses would be definitive proof. Anyone in control of those wallets could do it in 30 seconds. Craig Wright has never done it. In 2024, a British court ruled that Wright was not Satoshi Nakamoto. The judge found that Wright had forged documents in his effort to prove his identity and that his claims were false. It was one of the most definitive judicial verdicts in the history of cryptocurrency. Wright appealed. The mystery, in the legal sense, continues. The group theory. There is one more possibility that deserves serious consideration. What if Satoshi Nakamoto is not one person, but several. The Bitcoin white paper is polished and cohesive in a way that suggests a single authorial voice. But the code base, the actual software, is large. It is detailed. It covers an enormous range of technical challenges. Some researchers have argued that it represents more work than a single person could plausibly have completed, while also maintaining the public communications that Satoshi was engaged in. The writing in Satoshi's forum posts and emails shows occasional inconsistencies, subtle shifts in phrasing, in tone, in the level of technical detail. Some researchers read these as evidence of multiple authors taking turns, communicating as a single identity. The theory is unprovable, but it is not unreasonable. A small group, 3 people perhaps, or 5, people who had been thinking about these problems for years, who came together at the right moment, who agreed to build the thing they had all been dreaming about, and then agreed to disappear together, to let the work speak for itself. It is a compelling image, and it fits perfectly with nothing and nothing with it. None of them fit, not completely. Every candidate leaves unanswered questions, unexplained gaps, evidence that points in the wrong direction. The mystery has been examined from every angle by some of the most technically skilled and intellectually rigorous people in the world, and the mystery remains, which means the truth might be stranger than any of them. By 2010, Bitcoin had grown the small community of cypherpunks who had built it. It had its first real-world transaction. It had its first exchange. It had its first market price. New developers were contributing to the code base. New users were joining every week. Forum discussions were becoming more sophisticated, more technical, more political. The community was developing its own culture, its own arguments, its own heroes and villains. And Satoshi, watching all of this, was beginning to worry. The worry was not about Bitcoin's technical development. That seemed to be going well. The worry was about attention. In the early days, Bitcoin was an obscure project known only to a small community of cryptography enthusiasts. Governments, regulators, and law enforcement had no particular reason to care about it. It was too small, too theoretical, too easy to dismiss. But the system was working. Real money was flowing through it. Real exchanges were operating. And the story of a system designed to operate outside the control of governments and central banks was becoming exactly the kind of story that attracted exactly the kind of attention that Satoshi feared. In December of 2010, WikiLeaks, the document publishing organization, was under enormous financial pressure. PayPal, Visa, and MasterCard had all cut off their services to WikiLeaks following pressure from the United States government in the aftermath of the release of classified diplomatic cables. Without the ability to accept donations, WikiLeaks faced existential financial crisis. Someone in the Bitcoin forum suggested that WikiLeaks should start accepting Bitcoin donations. Satoshi responded, and the response was unusual. It was almost alarmed. "No, don't bring it on," they wrote. "The project needs to grow gradually so the software can be strengthened along the way." I make this appeal to WikiLeaks not to try to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a small beta community in its infancy. You would not stand to get more than pocket change, and the heat you would bring would likely destroy us at this stage. There was something in that message, a protectiveness, a fear, a sense of someone who understood that the thing they had built was fragile, that it could be crushed before it had a chance to survive. Satoshi was not concerned about WikiLeaks as a political organization. They were concerned about survival, about giving governments a reason to act before Bitcoin was strong enough to withstand the attention. The WikiLeaks situation crystallized something that Satoshi had perhaps been thinking about for some time. And then, shortly after that post, Satoshi began to disappear. In April of 2011, Satoshi sent a private email to Gavin Andresen, who had become one of Bitcoin's lead developers, a programmer who had been contributing code and helping coordinate the growing developer community. Satoshi had, over the preceding months, been gradually passing more responsibility to Gavin, giving him administrative access to the Bitcoin.org domain, including him in decisions, preparing him, in a sense, for what was coming. The email said, "I wish you wouldn't keep talking about me as a mysterious, shadowy figure. The press just turns that into a pirate currency story. Maybe instead make it about the open source project and give more credit to your dev contributors. It helps motivate them. And then, I've moved on to other things. Other things. That is almost all we have. A handful of emails, a few forum posts, and then nothing." The last post attributed to Satoshi Nakamoto in the Bitcoin forum was made on December 12, 2010. It was technical in nature, a discussion of a specific feature of the software. There was no farewell, no acknowledgement that it would be the last thing they ever said in this community they had built. The account simply went silent. Why did they go? No one knows for certain, but we can speculate carefully. One possibility is that Satoshi always intended Bitcoin to be leaderless. A system with a single known creator is vulnerable to legal pressure, to government seizure, to the all-too-human problem of one person becoming a point of failure or a point of corruption. By disappearing, Satoshi ensured that no government could subpoena them, no court could compel them, no journalist could photograph them. The project became truly decentralized, not just in its technical architecture, but in its human structure too. Another possibility is fear. Satoshi understood, perhaps better than anyone, what Bitcoin might become. They had seen how governments responded to threats to their monetary systems. The developer of eGold, a previous digital currency, had been prosecuted. The founder of Liberty Reserve went to prison. Creating a genuinely effective alternative financial system outside government control was not a legally safe activity. A third possibility is simply this: they had done what they came to do. The work was complete. The system was running. Others were capable of maintaining and developing it. It was time to let go. And there is one more thing to consider, something quiet and strange. When Satoshi mined those first Bitcoin blocks in the early days of January 2009, when they were the only person on the network, they accumulated an enormous quantity of Bitcoin. Researchers who have studied the blockchain carefully believe they can identify the coins mined during Bitcoin's earliest period, the period when only Satoshi was active. The cluster is estimated at around 1 million Bitcoin. 1 million Bitcoin. As of today, that is worth somewhere in the range of $50 billion, depending on the price at any given moment. Those coins have never moved, not a single one, not once in 15 years. There is a phenomenon in the Bitcoin community. Periodically, perhaps once a year, perhaps more often, someone notices an old wallet showing signs of activity. A transaction from an address that was dormant for years. A movement of coins that had not moved since the very earliest days of Bitcoin. Each time it happens, the internet holds its breath. Is it Satoshi? It never is, or at least it has never been confirmed to be. The movements are always traced to other early miners, other people who participated in Bitcoin's infancy and who are now, for one reason or another, moving old coins. Each time it happens, the price of Bitcoin moves. Each time, the community watches with an intensity that is almost religious. Because if Satoshi moved their coins, all of them, or even a fraction, it would be the most significant event in Bitcoin's history since the day it was created. The questions it would raise are almost impossible to fully think through. Would they sell? If they sold even a fraction of 1 million Bitcoin, the market would move dramatically. The price would fall. Billions of dollars in value would shift. People who had invested their savings in Bitcoin would be affected. Would they speak? Would they finally reveal themselves? Would they explain why they built this, why they left, where they have been? Would they be arrested? In several countries, the legal status of what Satoshi created remains uncertain. A known, named, locatable creator of Bitcoin might face significant legal risk. The silence of those coins is one of the most discussed topics in the cryptocurrency world. It has been analyzed from every possible angle. Some people believe Satoshi is dead, that the person or people behind the name are gone, and the coins will sit there forever, permanently inaccessible. A monument, in a way. $50 billion worth of ash scattered in a digital field. Some people believe Satoshi is alive and watching and still thinking. That the coins will move someday, when the time is right, when Satoshi decides the world is ready to hear from them again. That the silence is not an absence, but a choice, a long and patient choice. Some people believe the coins are simply lost, that the private keys, the mathematical passwords that control those wallets, were stored somewhere, on some hardware that no longer works, on some piece of paper that has been destroyed. That Satoshi, having built a system they intended never to use for personal gain, simply did not take adequate precautions to preserve access to what they had earned. There is something almost mythological about this story when you step back and look at it. A figure appears at a moment of crisis. They offer a gift, a new way to think about money, about trust, about the relationship between individuals and institutions. They build the gift, carefully and patiently, and hand it to the world, and then they vanish. No requests, no demands, no legacy tour, no book deal, no speaking circuit, no foundation in their name, nothing. Just the work and the silence that followed it. In the history of technological innovation, this is almost without precedent. The people who build things that change the world almost invariably want credit for it. They want their names on the product. They want to shape the narrative. They want the interviews and the profiles and the biography. Satoshi wanted none of it. Or at least, they acted as if they wanted none of it. If Satoshi is alive today, and if they are, they would likely be somewhere between 50 and 70 years old, based on the linguistic and temporal patterns in their writing. Then they have spent the last 15 years watching their creation grow from nothing to a global phenomenon worth more than $1 trillion, watching it become the subject of Senate hearings and presidential executive orders, watching it be called a scam and a revolution and everything in between, watching people become millionaires because of it, and watching people lose everything, watching the wallets that hold 1 million of the first Bitcoin ever created, and choosing each day to do nothing. What does that feel like? I have thought about that question many times while researching this story. What it might feel like to have built something that has touched hundreds of millions of lives, and to have done it entirely from the shadows. To know your own name is one of the most searched terms on the internet, and to remain unknown. To have changed the world and to have no one who can thank you for it. Maybe it feels like relief. Maybe the whole point, the deep, structural point of the thing Satoshi built, was that it was designed not to need them, not to need anyone. A system that would run without a master, a network that would persist without a leader. The ultimate expression of a philosophy that said, trust the math, not the human. And Satoshi, by disappearing, proved the point. Bitcoin did not die when they left. It grew. It became something larger than any single person could have managed or controlled. It became, in the truest sense, what it was designed to be. To close this story properly, we need to take a moment to consider what happened after Satoshi left. Because what happened is extraordinary. In the years following Satoshi's departure, Bitcoin grew along a trajectory that almost no one had predicted. Not its supporters who hoped for it, not its critics who dismissed it, not the economists who wrote it off as a technological curiosity, not the regulators who assumed they could easily control or shut it down. By 2013, the price of one Bitcoin had gone from a few cents to over $1,000. By 2017, it reached nearly 20,000. The world noticed. Banks began issuing research reports. Governments began writing legislation. Newspapers that had ignored Bitcoin for years began covering it breathlessly. And then it crashed, and recovered, and crashed, and recovered. Each cycle larger than the last. Each crash followed by a new peak that exceeded anything that had come before. People made fortunes. People lost fortunes. Exchanges were built and some of them collapsed. Fraudsters built elaborate schemes using Bitcoin's credibility. Visionary engineers built new systems on top of Bitcoin's foundation. In 2015, a young developer named Vitalik Buterin, who had first encountered Bitcoin as a teenager, launched a new blockchain called Ethereum. It was built on principles Satoshi had pioneered, but extended them dramatically. Ethereum introduced programmable smart contracts, the concept that Szabo had described decades earlier. It became the foundation for an entirely new industry. By 2021, Bitcoin's total market value had exceeded $1 trillion. It had been accepted as legal tender by the government of El Salvador. It was held on the balance sheets of publicly traded companies. Institutional investors, who had once dismissed it as a toy for tech enthusiasts, were buying it in vast quantities. The United States government, having seized Bitcoin from various criminal enterprises, became one of the largest Bitcoin holders in the world. Satoshi had not started a company. They had not raised venture capital. They had not sought government approval. They had published a 9-page paper, written some code, and set something loose in the world. What it became was entirely up to everyone else. And through all of it, through the booms and crashes, the fraud and the innovation, the political battles and the technological breakthroughs, Satoshi's coins sat still. 1 million Bitcoin. Unmoved, silent. A monument to the original vision, or a mystery waiting to be resolved, depending on how you look at it. There is something worth saying about the cypherpunks, the community that Satoshi came from and built for. They had been trying for decades to solve the problem that Satoshi solved. They had been arguing about digital privacy and financial freedom since the early 1990s. They had built tools, important tools, tools that millions of people use today, but they had not built the thing. Satoshi built the thing, and then walked away from it. Some members of the original cypherpunk community have said, privately and publicly, that this was the most cypherpunk thing Satoshi could have done. That the act of disappearing was itself a kind of proof, not just of the technical system, but of the philosophy behind it, that a truly decentralized system does not need its creator. That true freedom is not given by a leader, but built into the structure of the thing itself. Finney, who had been the first to receive Bitcoin, who had spent years corresponding with Satoshi and contributing to Bitcoin's early development, died in August 2014. He was 58 years old. He had been diagnosed with ALS in 2009, the same year Bitcoin launched. In the final years of his life, as his body progressively failed him, Finney continued to code. He wrote software using an eye-tracking device, when that was the only tool his body could still operate. He never stopped. Before he died, he wrote about his experience of Bitcoin's early days with the calm satisfaction of someone who had seen something important and known it was important, even at the beginning. Whether or not he knew something about Satoshi's identity, and some believe he did, he never said. He was cryonically preserved, as he had always planned. His body rests in liquid nitrogen, waiting for a future that may or may not arrive. We have come to the end of this story, or rather, to the end of the part of it we know. The story itself continues. It continues every day, in every transaction that is added to the blockchain, in every new user who holds their first fraction of a Bitcoin, in every argument about what this technology means and what it will become. And somewhere at the center of it, somewhere in the silence between the lines of code, Somewhere in those unspent coins that have not moved in 15 years, there is a person, or a group of people, or a memory. Satoshi Nakamoto. I want to say something directly to you now before we close. If you have followed this story all the way to the end, if you are still awake or still listening somewhere in that comfortable space between wakefulness and sleep, I hope it has given you something to think about. Not just about Bitcoin, but about what it means to build something, about what it means to let go of it, about the strange relationship between a creator and their creation once the creation no longer needs them. We live in an age that craves credit, that wants attribution, verification, a name and a face attached to every idea. An age of personal branding and thought leadership and founder mythology. An age in which the story of the creator is often considered as important as the thing created. Satoshi gave us something rare, the idea without the person, the work without the signature. There is something quietly beautiful about that. The mystery, honestly, may never be solved. The people who know, if there are people who know, have chosen silence. The evidence points in several directions and settles nowhere. The coins sit unmoved, the wallets are silent, and Bitcoin continues. Every 10 minutes, somewhere in the world, a new block is added to the chain. Every 10 minutes, a mathematical puzzle is solved, and a small batch of transactions is permanently recorded, and the chain grows by one link. It has been doing this without stopping since January 3rd, 2009. Through market crashes and regulatory battles and technological upgrades and political fights and the deaths of key figures and the rise of competitors. Through all of it, the chain has continued, exactly as Satoshi designed it to. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you are warm. I hope the weight of the day is beginning to lift. I hope that whatever mysteries are living in your own mind, whatever questions you have been turning over, can rest for now. Some things do not need to be resolved tonight. Some questions are comfortable to live with. Let your breath slow down. Let your thoughts soften. There is nothing left to figure out tonight. The blockchain continues, block by block, hour by hour, year by year. Somewhere in a wallet that has never moved, $50 billion sits in silence. And in the morning, the mystery will still be there, exactly where you left it. Good night. Word count. Top 14 ration, estimated duration 115 minutes at 120 to 130 WPM.